We're going to turn now to talk about literacy skill supply and the demand that the economy creates for people to put those skills to economic use in the labor market. We're going to start with a look at the distribution of jobs in the territory by the level they demand. If we look at the right-hand panel first, the yellow box is the proportion of jobs that fall at level 3, and so the biggest majority of jobs in Nunavut require level 3 skills of the workers. There's a smaller number of level 2 jobs and smaller numbers of level 4 and 5 jobs, but on average people need level 3 jobs. The left-hand panel compares and contrasts that distribution for Aboriginal workers. One sees from the chart that more Aboriginal workers are in level 2 jobs and more are in level 3 jobs and relatively fewer in level 4 and 5. This means that Aboriginal workers in the territory will by definition earn less and be more subject to unemployment and lower levels of adult education and training in the workplace. Overall, 80% of the jobs held by Aboriginals require prose literacy skills in English or French at level 3 or above. If we turn now to supply, we have a set of projections that tell us what the supply of literacy skill will be out into the future. Look at the left-hand panel first. It shows that out to 2016, we expect the numbers of level 1 and level 2 adults to fall fairly steadily, and the numbers of level 3, 4, and 5 adults to stay about the same. The right-hand panel expresses these same projections in terms of the proportions of adults at different skill levels. And we see that about 46 or 47% of adults will be at level 1 and 2 out to 2016. And this is the skill level, you'll remember, that we think places the workers at those levels and the economy at risk in a global, very competitive global economy. We now are going to turn to look at utilization rates at various levels. Of the available supply, how much does the economy actually use? We'll start with the Canadian data that suggests for the supply of literacy skill possessed by Aboriginal workers in Canada is equal to the demand for literacy skill, so they're roughly in balance, something that's economically good. If we look at the Northwest Territories and the Yukon, both of those economies use less of the available supply than there is supply. And so increasing the demand for skills, increasing employment levels generally, and the knowledge intensity of jobs is going to use that available surplus of skills and yield significant economic benefits. In Nunavut, we see a completely different pattern where the current jobs held by Aboriginal workers actually demand 103% of the skills of the workers in those jobs. So there's a significant literacy skill shortage. 3% doesn't seem like much, but when you convert it to points and how many points of literacy, each worth $155 in additional earnings per year, it amounts to a big economic problem. We're going to turn now and look at utilization by the skill levels of the jobs demanded compared to the skills of people that are in those jobs. The first chart are for Inuit workers living off reserve, and we see that there are large surpluses of people at level 1 and level 2 and shortages of workers at level 3, 4, and 5. So the problem at level 3, 4, and 5 is there are jobs, there are not workers to fill those jobs with the right level of skill. Pushing this even further down, 58% of Nunavut workers are in literacy skill shortages. This is a comparison at the actual level of individual. Given the occupation that someone's in, do they have the skills to do that job fully and satisfactorily? And just under 60% of all workers in the territory have skills that are lower than that demand level. Another slightly less than 30% have just the amount of skill required by their jobs. And that's not so good because it means there's no cushion for those workers to rely on should literacy skill demands rise as we expect. And finally, there's about 15% of workers in the territory who are in literacy skill surplus. And if you were able to create more knowledge and skill-rich employment, you could use that surplus and get significant increases in productivity and GDP as a result. So now we turn to look at, of Aboriginal groups in the population in Nunavut, how relatively are they disadvantaged to the general population? We see that Aboriginals living off reserve are about 2% worse off than the general population, more likely to be in shortage, and less likely to be in balance and surplus. So we've established that that literacy matters. It's going to matter more in the future, and that literacy touches a large number of people. There are big shortages, particularly among Aboriginal populations. And those problems in Aboriginal populations in the territory mean that they're going to be the last to be hired, have lower wages when they do get hired, be much more likely to get laid off, and have much less access to adult education and training. So if there is a problem, we now are going to turn to figure out what the nature of the problem is, what it would cost to fix, and what the potential benefits would be were we to invest the resources necessary to eliminate literacy skill shortages in the territory. About 11,000 out of 15,000 Aboriginal workers in Nunavut are in literacy skill shortages, so a very high percentage. And so we have reason to believe that that has a profound effect on those workers, but also on the performance of the Nunavut economy overall. So that's the bad news. The good news is most of those people in shortage are actually in literacy segments C and D, and these segments are people who can read quite well, but not well enough to master tasks at levels 3, 4, and 5. The investment required to raise their skills is relatively small on a per worker basis, but because there's so many workers with the problem, the total bill ends up being quite large. We have an estimate of that bill of some $38 million would have to be spent to eliminate literacy skill shortages in the territory in the Aboriginal population. So the fix would be expensive. However, that fix is likely to yield significant economic benefits in terms of increased productivity that will in turn increase people's wages and earnings. And so we're looking at rates of return of anywhere from about 89% to 200% each and every year following the investment. And those are attractive enough to make this worth doing. So if we know there's a problem, we have to decide where our resources are best invested. And to help that process, we've developed literacy snapshots for most of the areas in the country. I'm going to show you Iqaluit. In this case, somewhat areas that have very high levels of people at 1 and 2 show up as orange or red or yellow. And the greener the presentation gets in this map, the lower the proportion of level 1 and 2. And it shows that except for one very small neighborhood, there are relatively very low proportions of adults at level 1 and 2. A good thing. We've also done a report card for Iqaluit where we compare their literacy profile to that in 328 other communities. They actually rate very well in terms of literacy, get a grade of A, and they rank 23 out of 328 communities. So demand in Iqaluit economy is high. They have about 1.3 million literacy points that they could put to economic use, and the average score of an employed worker in Iqaluit is actually 301 points, well into level 3, where we think we need to be. The Iqaluit economy also uses a high percentage of the available supply, 75% in fact, well above the national average of 66. This is good, but it also implies that there's very little room to grow by increasing the demand for skill. In order to eliminate literacy skill shortages in Iqaluit, someone would have to invest something like $2 million or about $1,500 per learner, given their learning needs and characteristics. This investment, were it undertaken, would be expected to yield $10 million in increased earnings each and every year following the investment, and would increase average workers' wages by about $6,600. And there are some literacy skill surpluses in Iqaluit, and if we found a way to eliminate those, earnings would go up each and every year following the investment by about $4 million. Big numbers suggesting that investing in literacy is well worthwhile. So by way of summary, I'd like to recap the key points of this presentation. First and foremost, finding a way to increase literacy skills is fundamentally important to Canada's economic development, our social progress, and our ability to compete with in a very competitive global economy. This is particularly true for Nunavut, that has large numbers of workers, and particularly Aboriginal workers that have skills below the level we think we need to compete. And so literacy, we can think of it as something that creates most of the inequality that exists in the territory in the things we value most: access to employment, earnings, health, and social levels of social engagement. So fixing Nunavut's literacy problem, and particularly Aboriginal people's literacy problem, has to be a policy priority for the territory's citizens, the territory's employers, the territorial government, and the federal government. So thank you. Want to know more about literacy? Go to any of the following websites shown on the screen: the website for Data Angel, the website for Statistics Canada, the website for Bow Valley College, or the website for the Canadian Council on Learning. You'll find out about how important literacy is to Canada's future economic competitiveness and our collective well-being. Thank you.